We're going to get started here soon so we can get you on the road on Friday afternoon, right? Everybody wants to get home? So how was the first day at the symposium? Very good. Excellent, excellent. Everybody having a good morning? Awesome. We have a really good general session planned for this morning. And before that, I have some people I'd like to recognize, but I'm just going to wait a minute or two for some more people to come in. We have a lot of empty tables over here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Like I said, we have a great closing general session planned for this morning, but before we get to that, we have some attorneys we would like to recognize from the Special Needs Registry and also pro bono attorneys. These attorneys were selected for recognition by the circuits they are located in for their outstanding work with children who have special needs. The Guardian Ad Litem program would like to recognize the following registry and pro bono attorneys, and we ask that you stand up when your name is called and remain standing. And we'll hold the applause till the end. We have Katie Boast from the 8th Circuit, Cassandra Bowie from the 7th Circuit, Valletta Cameron, 18th Circuit, Henry Cawthon, 3rd Circuit, Andrew Chang, 12th Circuit, Stuart Cook, 16th Circuit, Krista Deviney, 14th Circuit, Barbara Glass, 9th Circuit, William Gottfried, 6th Circuit, Scott Horvat, 13th Circuit, Stephanie Johnson, 2nd Circuit, Beth Kernan, 4th Circuit, Karen Lattis, 11th Circuit, Leslie Lesane, 10th Circuit, Crystal Marsh, 19th Circuit, Penny Martin, 15th Circuit, Sarah Aquendo, 20th Circuit, Andrea Roberts, 1st Circuit, Karen Rodriguez, 5th Circuit, Tasha Simmons, 17th Circuit, and for appeals, Beth Rowland. Please give all of these registry and pro bono attorneys. Very good. The Guardian Ad Litem program really appreciates everything you do. We can't thank you enough for your talents, treasure, and time. So thank you. I would now like to introduce Stephanie Zimmerman, Children's Legal Services Deputy Director, Statewide Director of Appeals from the Department of Children and Families. Ms. Zimmerman will highlight key points from the majority of the workshops at the symposium and in All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten format. The plenary will be a supercharged learning experience where attendees will not only review the most important concepts from workshops they attended, but also get highlights from other presentations they could not attend. Since all of the workshops are recorded, it will allow attendees the opportunity to identify workshops they wish to view after the conclusion of the symposium. Stephanie?
Good morning, everyone. So, when they asked me to present, all 24 topics within our short period of time here. So, what did I decide to do? I decided to leave it to the masters. So, I'm going to defer to the presenters themselves and the key points that they made throughout their presentations. And when I thought about how to really sum this up, I did think about that poem, All I Really Need to Know About Life I Learned in Kindergarten. Now, Robert Fulghum did that poem in the idea that there's certain life lessons that we can use. For example, share everything, don't hit people, put things back where you found them. Well, as I was looking at the presentations that were delivered since yesterday, there are a lot of lessons that do fall out of those that we can apply to our everyday life in the dependency world. So let's talk about some of those. The first presentation I want to hit on today is the Understanding Due Process presentation. And the lesson that really came out of this presentation is that we have to play fair, right? This is supposed to be a non-adversarial process. Supposed to be. But really, if we do give everybody the level playing field, then we have the opportunity to really produce best results for our children. And that is the goal of everybody in this room. We do have a unified goal. So let's talk about due process for a moment. So there's two different kinds of due process for those non-lawyers in the room. We have what's called substantive due process and procedural due process. So substantive due process concerns a court's ability to protect what we call the fundamental rights. So our fundamental rights are our rights to life and liberty. Now, despite what the Beastie Boys have been saying since 1986, we do not have a fundamental right to party. We might at one point, but as of right now, we have a fundamental right to life and liberty. And incorporated in that fundamental right is the right to parent. So, the 2000 case of Troxel versus Granville really summarized what that fundamental parental right is. And what it means is courts are generally going to defer to parents with their parenting decisions. However, the state can intervene at any point that it has a compelling governmental interest. And that compelling governmental interest comes into play when there's a child safety concern, when a child is in danger. And all the lawyers in the room know that the Padgett case here from the Florida Supreme Court made it clear that between the parents' rights and the child's welfare will ultimately always prevail. But despite that, we have to tread lightly. The interference has to be narrowly tailored. And so what Candace and Rachel discussed is how you go through the entire process and not tread upon that fundamental due process right to parent. But they also talked about the second aspect of procedural due process, the right to notice and the opportunity to be heard. They talked about notice in the form of subpoenas and actually having a fair hearing on these things. So we encourage you to watch their presentation to really see how due process is implemented throughout the entire system, specifically due process in the context of paternity and incarcerated parents, and really how we can work together to achieve those best outcomes. So sticking on the theme of really giving our people a fair playing field, or really give everyone what is a reasonable opportunity for a fair playing field, Mr. Dietz talked about the reasonable accommodations that we should be making to allow our parents and our children to really get the services they need to achieve permanency. So he talked about the law as it stands when it comes to disabilities. That law defines what a disability is, and there's 3 different ways to do that, and I'm going to make you watch the presentation to figure that out. But he also talked about those services. So we can't impose services if there is going to be some impediment to the person being able to complete the service. He gave the example of what if they have to go upstairs to get to this parenting class and they can't navigate stairs? Or what if they only know ASL? We need to provide some kind of interpreter. But he also described at what point is a reasonable accommodation no longer reasonable? And you have to navigate that. So he discussed specific scenarios and methods that we could use to employ those services in a way that is giving everybody an equal opportunity. And I really do want you to watch this presentation because there was an image that he showed that actually I tried to find last night, and I really wish I could have presented. It showed what I believe was 4 different people, maybe 3, and they were all reaching for some way to an apple tree. And they all had a different way of how they had to reach. One had to get up a ramp, one was being helped. That image kind of stuck in my mind because it's not that everybody is exactly equal, but that we are giving them a reasonable opportunity to try to be equal, to all get that apple. And it was a great image, and if you watch nothing else from that presentation, please look at that image and let it stick in your mind. So keeping kind of on the theme of parents and representation, there was a presentation on dependency representation and the JAC process. So the lesson that we can learn from this one is let the process work for you. So the experts here are actual members from the JAC, the Justice Administration Commission. So they walked people through the process, the setting up the My Jack online profile, how to bill, how to invoice. Now, you might be sitting here as a guardian ad litem attorney or guardian ad litem volunteer and saying, why does that matter to me? The reason it matters to you and to everybody in this room is that we know that the only way that we get more representation and the way that we get people to stand up and be recognized is kind of by bringing them into the fold, right? And you can't bring people into the fold if you don't know how the process works yourself. So, if you watch this presentation and understand it a little better, you can bring people in to drink the Kool-Aid like we did. Our next presentation that I want to hit on is our Title 4E. So the lesson from this one is really know your options. Title 4E. Who's heard about Title 4E in the last month? Who's heard about Title 4E in the last week? Who's heard about Title 4E yesterday? Who heard about it about an hour ago? So Title 4E is our life from here on out. We are very soon going to be having the sunset of the waiver. And to me, the way we talk about it, it's like the apocalypse is coming, right? We are all gearing up. We all have our little bunkers built. We have not stocked it with food. We have not stocked it with supplies. We kind of are figuring out, what do our bunkers need? Well, the GAP program is going to be one of those supplies in our bunker, okay? So Courtney walked us through the process of getting somebody eligible for GAP, and it is a multi-step process. First, we got to have the placement. We can have placements with those relatives, non-relatives, and kin, but they need to be licensed. There's a special type of license that's being created for those placements called a Level 1 license. It's child-specific. That doesn't mean that they will be able to take that license and now take any child into the home, because it's child-specific. But assuming they do get that license, we then can work through the process with them to make sure that that family, should they choose guardianship as the permanency option, are entitled to the full array of benefits from it. So she talked about those benefits. They're going to get more money, which is great for our caregivers. But there's another benefit that maybe I just attach my heartstrings to a little bit more than the rest of you, but we are now going to have a tuition waiver for any child who turns 18 in a GAP placement. So currently, you have to be 16 or 17 when the guardianship closes in order to get that tuition waiver. Now, while we don't want 5-year-olds in a guardianship by any means, if we have a 12-year-old that's in a guardianship all the way until that child is 18, that child will now be eligible for Florida tuition and fees to be waived. That's a huge benefit. So while we think about this in the context of 4E and, we need to make up our money to care for our kids, think about it also in what we're now going to be able to afford our kids, a benefit to them. Okay, Social Security. When I see Social Security, I have to admit, in my safe space of this room, it scares the bejesus out of me, right? I see the word Social Security and I go, I don't know enough. I don't know what I should do, but you know what? I'm going to have a case where somebody needs Social Security in some way, right? So really the lesson of this particular case is that we have to look out for others. And they walked us through the process for somebody to become a representative payee and what that means. That representative payee has to pay for the current needs of the child, but they also have to in some way see the future. They have to anticipate future needs. But last but not least, they also are going to have to report their actions, and there are things that co-align with that responsibility. Now, this presentation, I am imploring you to watch because, again, who has to go find these representative payees? We do. We have to bring people in, and so it's very hard to bring people in if you don't tell them what they're going to be able to expect once they're in and in that role. So the more you educate yourself about it, the more you can communicate realistically what is going to be expected of them. So Ms. Jordan also gave a presentation on Adulting 101. All right, so when I see the word adulting, I think back to my little self when I was 16 and thought I knew everything, right? And I thought I could just take on the world, just could not wait until I was 18 and the world would open up. Now that I'm a little bit older, the image that comes to my mind is actually Admiral Akbar from Star Wars, Return of the Jedi, screaming, "It's a trap." Becoming an adult is a trap. We think that it's going to be this great thing, but oh my gosh, the world opens to you, and man, is that world mean to you, right? This presentation tries to make the world a little less mean, because being an adult is not easy. So when I went to this presentation, I was blown away by the number of services that Ms. Jordan described. There were services that are available to our youth to help them get licenses. She gave an example of trying to get a nursing license. Tools that they can get. If they want to be a mechanic, there are tools available to purchase tools. That we can do job coaching, we can do counseling, we can do treatment, we can do all these things. And even better, there are ways under the law that our youth can work and still get their benefits for certain periods of time. Did I know this before yesterday? No. Did I know this 5 years ago? No, and I really wish I did know this 5 years ago. So you might not have a situation right now where it applies, but watch it now, because some way, at some time, you will have a youth who either you will represent or will be on your caseload who is going to need these services. And I can't think of a better expert than Ms. Jordan describing all the services. So please, please watch this one. So, we talked about trauma at the beginning of the opening session. We followed it up with 2 more presentations on trauma. We talked about the impact of trauma, and we also talked about trauma-informed care. I would like to talk about the ACEs for a moment. So we talked about ACEs in the opening session, and it really was developed in 1994 as a way to now understand the impact of adverse childhood experiences on our health. But I don't know how many people in the room have done an ACEs inventory of themselves. So 2 years ago, I was sitting in a room, and they asked us to do this inventory. So if you guys could just, in your head, kind of keep track. I'm going to pop up the questions. So the first question being, did a parent or other adult in your household often or very often swear at you, or in any way made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? You can read the rest of the questions. Did they do these things to you? For each one, you count 1. Next set of questions. Did you often feel that you were not very important or loved? Did you often or very often not have enough to eat, not have enough clothes? Was a biological parent ever lost to you through divorce, abandonment, or other reason? And the last set of questions, was your mother or stepmother ever pushed, slapped, kicked, beaten, repeatedly hit? Did you live with a problem drinker? Did somebody in your household ever have any kind of mental illness? And did a household member ever go to prison? The lesson from the ACEs that I'm going to ask for you to remember is assume everyone has a history. Now, why did I ask you to go through that? Well, everybody has their own ACEs number. And 2 years ago when I was asked to do this, we all did our ACEs number. And we were in a safe space. And they asked us to share those ACEs number. And there are 30 of us in the room in the dependency community. And I would say there were probably about 4 of us that had less than 3 ACEs. 4 ACEs means that you are at the higher risk for some kind of health-related disorder. About 15 in the room had between 4 and 7. So that's leaving another 11. There were 11 in the room that had between 8 to 10. The one who had 10 wears a robe to work every day, and you would have never known it. And so when that individual shared with us in the safe space what that individual was raised in, we were blown away, because as that individual wears the robe every day, you would have never guessed of all of the negative impact. But that individual learned from it and had people work for them, had people work for that individual to bring them out of that kind of level of abuse and change their life. And so that's why I repeat, assume everybody has a history in some way. Our lawyers, our volunteers, our judges. So the presentations are going to talk about that impact on the trauma, how it really is a public health issue, and what's predictable is preventable. And then the trauma-informed care presentation is really going to be talking to us about the different points of trauma-informed care. The fourth point, most importantly, is we have to avoid re-traumatization. And so they're going to identify for you triggers and common responses so that you can avoid that re-traumatization. And they're going to give you tips on how to create that safe space. All right, so there's some times in life where you have to recognize that you are not the best expert on something, and this is one of those times. So I found a lovely video that actually is going to explain this particular topic. So for more information on the trust-based relational intervention, I implore you to watch the presentation that they gave. Once you learn about that, once you learn about trauma-informed care, you have to figure out where are we going to get these services. And the Medicaid managed care presentation talks about some of those services. And the lesson from this one is we have to think outside the box. So they have these services that are called the in lieu of services benefit. These are alternative services that are not in the state plan, but they are deemed medically appropriate, and they are provided and available to our children. The kinds of services are the community-based wraparound services, infant mental health care, things like that. For you to know how to leverage those services for your clients, you need to watch this presentation and learn from the experts about how to leverage those services. So going from the services and the trauma, let's shift to our favorite subject, teenagers. It's our favorite subject, right? That's why the title was Find Teens Confusing. By show of hands, who here was ever a teenager? Okay. By a show of hands, who here is thankful that they are not currently a teenager in today's world? Wow, the lesson that we have is that world has changed. We serve thousands of teenagers in our system. If you do not have a teenager on your caseload, you just haven't had enough cases yet, right? I don't know of a lawyer that hasn't had a teenager, and I would suspect almost all of our volunteers in some way have probably had a teenager if they've had multiple cases. We have to serve them properly, but we also need to know and appreciate that they're growing up in a different world than ours. They're exposed to far more than we ever were. So I want to talk about some of those scary statistics. So the CDC last year, in 2017, published a study of high schoolers. And one of the scariest facts to me was that 28% of them were sad almost every day for 2 or more weeks in a row in the prior month of the study. That's frightening. That's more than 1 in 4 kids are sad for that long. 13% of them had 4 more drinks if they were females, or 5 or more drinks of alcohol in a row within a couple of hours, at least one day in the month prior to the study. 34% of them had used marijuana in the month prior to the study. 29% of them ate a meal with their family on 4 days in a row, or 4 days of the week. Only 29%. So the days of Ward and June and Wally and the Beeves sitting around the family dinner table all the time are gone. Maybe I'm dating myself by talking about Ward and June and Wally and the Beeve. But what we have to keep in mind, probably speaking, most of them don't have the experiences that we had. Or if they do, perhaps we can shed some light based upon our own experiences. And last but not least, 20% of males carried a weapon onto school campus at least one day in the last month. That was either a knife, a weapon, or some kind of club-like item. That's kind of frightening, especially with some of our school events that like Parkland. It's quite a wake-up call. So let's talk about what they actually presented at this training. So at this training, they talked about how to actually meet a youth where they are. So those are the things that our youth are facing, and they're going to engage in various behavior, and it's up to you to be there for them. And so what they did was they broke everybody into groups, and they talked about the difference between a mentor and an advocate and how that can overlap in some degree. And I really liked how they put it. So an advocate is taking front and center, and they're making arguments on behalf of that child and seeking what that child needs, whereas a mentor is walking side by side with the child. You can serve both roles for the child. And they did this nice little fun exercise towards the end called Memory Lane. They asked everybody in the room, can you think of 3 people in your life as a teenager who shaped your life in some way? And they positively shaped their life in some way. How did they do that? And now, go do that for another teenager. Next presentation I want to talk about is the runaway train, the Florida pipeline from school to prison. And the lesson really from this one is that everything has a consequence. When we suspend kids, when we imprison kids, it has a lifelong consequence to them. So she provided us some startling statistics. So in 2017 to 2018, that school year, there were 7,400 arrests from our public schools. It says here up on the screen that there's a 3.5 times more likelihood of black students being suspended than white students, but then she clarified that a black girl is 7 times more likely to be suspended than a white girl. And then we have that horrible statistic over on the right-hand side of 30% of our foster care youth are in the DJJ system because of placement-related behavioral issues. And that's just scary, and it's just a failure of our system. And the purpose of this presentation is to stop these failures. I want to provide you some other statistics. Now, I pulled down from the DJJ website the most frequent offenses. And it might be a little hard for you guys to read, but the top offense is assault and battery, then disorderly conduct, and then aggravated assault and battery. Those top 3 categories account for almost 50% of all the arrests. But what the presentation explained is sometimes assault includes a child threatening the teacher or making the teacher scared by the back talk. It would be probably startling to dig into these specific cases and actually find out what the level of assault was in these cases. So the presentation did discuss why these children enter the system. And sometimes they enter the system because there's zero tolerance policies in the school system for any kind of behavior. And sometimes they enter the system because those schools are overusing law enforcement, or maybe they're underusing services that are available to them. But it also helps you understand what we should do for our crossover youth. There are 1,000 crossover youth in our system right now, and they need the special protection because of the lifelong stigma and the lifelong consequences of the school to prison pipeline. On the topic of our juvenile justice system, there is also a presentation on the difference between how the juvenile courts treat children, whether they're in the DJJ system or the DCF system, and that was presented this morning. That was quite a lively conversation in that room. There were many tips given out in that room. There were many frustrations expressed in that room. Neither system is a perfect system, is my takeaway from it. But to kind of wrap it up very tightly, the DCF system is intended to provide various check marks to work through, to have assessments, and to have follow-up to ensure that these kids are getting the services necessary. DJJ, they just make sure that they're qualified, they're sentenced, and then it's up to DJJ to deal with them. But the scary thing is that 2/3 of all males and 3/4 of all females in our DJJ detention facilities meet the criteria for a mental health disorder. That's a startling number. And so they need the services. And so this presentation talks about those most common health issues and really what arguments you can, as an advocate, make for those children. Again, 1,000 crossover youth need you to make these arguments. Another presentation that we talked about the criminal aspect was our national crisis when autism is mistaken for criminal behavior. And really the lesson I took away from this presentation is that old adage, the more you know. The more that we know about it, the more that the autistic youth know about it, the more that law enforcement know about it, will make us provide a safer community for our autistic youth. So the picture on the screen is 10-year-old John Benjamin Haygood. I don't know if you guys are familiar with his case. It made major news down in the South Florida area. So John was arrested at a school for hitting a teacher. He did have a long history of hitting his teacher, but it also was directly correlated to his autism. The reason this made news in South Florida, and frankly made news nationally, was how the arrest went down, for lack of a better way of explaining it. It was videotaped. It was very brutal. It was no way we'd ever want to treat a child, much less an autistic child. And it really raised awareness of this issue that we have in our community with the police not being trained on how to encounter autistic youth. And so the presentation does talk about real-life examples of those encounters. And I'll warn you, some of them are very hard to watch. But we need to watch them because we need to educate ourselves on them. And the Just Dig It organization that the presenters come from are trying to make the efforts to really come up with a solution. And so their solution is what's called the wallet card. The wallet card is this personalized card that our autistic youth can provide to law enforcement to explain their particular issues. For example, one youth might have high sensitivity to lights and sounds. Obviously, if there's a cop car with lights blasting and the horns blaring, that youth is going to shut down. But if they are able to provide that card, that officer can understand, I need to turn down the lights, I need to turn down the sirens. Alternatively, the card could explain that the youth can't speak when nervous, would rather write things down. We need to get these cards for our youth. We also need to get them the training that the Just Dig It organization provides to the youth on how to properly present these cards to law enforcement. Keeping on the topic of our youth, we're going to switch to social media, right? So the first lesson in the All I Really Need to Know About Life I Learned in Kindergarten is share everything. And I think that's where we went wrong. So our new lesson is don't share everything. So nobody is going to find a picture of me from middle school on any online media because I had the privilege of growing up without social media. In this room, I'm just kind of curious, how many people were teenagers when there was Facebook and Instagram and all that fun stuff? There are a few hands. So the majority of us do not have the digital footprint that our youth have. And you know what? We're thankful for it, aren't we? Oh my gosh, we do not want to be embarrassed by the decisions we made as our youth. But sadly, now our youth has that everlasting digital footprint. In fact, it's a little surprising, some of the statistics. So 92% of 2-year-olds have an online presence. Why? Because my best friends post the picture of their babies 4 hours after they're born, right? Because everybody finds out through social media now. We used to actually go to the hospital and see the baby and wish them well, and now we just, oh, cute kid, we'll see you at the party later. But do 2-year-olds really need an online social presence? What the presentation asks you to do is just really think about it. Because 9-year-olds even have a say on how they feel about how they're being reflected on social media. And so the presentation really talks about the impact of that child's digital footprint and really asking you to consider the effect that your sharing can have on the child's current and future sense of self. They had a great phrase that they used with this that I'm going to hashtag, sharenting. Sharenting. For all the people who are parents, think about this the next time you share. Are you sharenting properly? I'm saying sharenting, not some other words that some people might have thought of. So what are those real best practices? And they actually raised an interesting conversation that I think we need to continue later. We are kind of in a catch-22 when it comes to our permanently committed youth, in that we love to post via heart galleries the pictures of our youth that are adoptable, right? We put their presence out there. Are we doing it in a way that that youth is comfortable with? We have to check ourselves to make sure that we really are doing it that way. So that's a conversation we need to carry on. Continuing on with our kids and what's really best for them, we're going to talk about the presentation that was given this morning on the access beyond the classroom. And the lesson really about this is you need to be inclusive. So I'd like you to think back on your memories from high school. So I was one of those kids that tried to get in every photo in the yearbook, right? I was in the AV club, I was on the yearbook team, I was on the swim team, I was on the National Honor Society, the Spanish National Honor Society, the Math Honor Society. Everything that I could get into, I would, right? Because we had to have resume builders. And so I loved being in the clubs. All of our youth in some way should have an opportunity to be in the clubs, or even after-school activities or summer camps. But some of our disabled youth are given unnecessary impediments to those activities. So this particular presentation explores the laws that provide them the access, that provide them the reasonable accommodations, and how we actually have to look at the specific child involved in that particular case and what we can do for that child, not just treat them as a class of children. Because what's going to happen when we do that? They're going to be able to participate, they're going to form friendships, they're going to build confidence, they're going to develop leadership skills, time management skills, and sometimes they're just going to work off energy because they're going to be able to play with one another. So we need to look at those opportunities for them and provide them. Keeping with the concept of really doing everything we can for the whole child, Mr. Litem gave a presentation this morning on really how we have to go below the surface. It's not just about Chapter 39 proceedings. Mr. Litem shared with me a story of a group meeting that he was at. And at this meeting, it was led by a youth who had aged out of foster care. And the people who were present were between the ages of 12 and 14. And they were asked, what really does foster care need more of? What do we need to do for foster care? So everybody was really quiet. Nobody wanted to speak first. And so when they were prompted again, what would you change about foster care? The first youth piped up and finally said, we'd like more donuts. And this is how you know, you're with youth, right? I agree with that youth. We need more donuts in foster care. And everybody in that room agreed. But they asked them to dig a little deeper. And so another youth then volunteered, I'd like to see my brother more. And many in the room shared that similar feeling. Then another one, after being prompted to say, think even bigger, said, I wish there was no foster care. And they talked about that, and really, how do you get there? Well, the youth said the only way we really fix the foster care system is to go back in time and keep us from ever going into foster care. And so that is what this presentation tries to do. This presentation tries to talk with you about addressing those needs beyond the Chapter 39 case, and really working with our kids today to prevent future kids from entering the system. I know we love our job security, but when we think about our job security, it's at the detriment of these kids, right? I think we all could probably do a different job and be happy with our different job if there was no longer a need for the dependency or the delinquency systems, right? And we have the opportunity to stop that if we put the time, the effort, and the services into it. Another presentation that kind of hits home for me is the representing transgender youth. And so my lesson from this one is that life can be really hard, and we should not try to make it even harder. The reason this presentation work kind of hits hard to me is because my cousin actually is transgender. My cousin is 45 years old and suffered for the entire adolescence, not understanding, not feeling well about how he was being perceived, didn't really know what it was. But I witnessed how my cousin went through gender affirmation and how now my cousin is a very happy, very healthy, very productive member of society once that affirmation occurred. And the same is true for our youth that are in care that are transgendered. They just want to be affirmed. And so this presentation really talks about how we can do that. It also talks about some of the challenges that we have in the foster care system. It comes down to sometimes as simple as the type of clothing that is purchased for our transgendered youth. And then it's as complicated as where are they placed and is their placement going to affirm that gender identity. Because gender identity is very different than sexual orientation. And people have to be educated on this to understand it. But there's some really scary statistics here about what happens to youth when they are not affirmed. 40% of transgender youth are homeless. They're 9 times more likely to commit suicide. And then even if they're in the safe home, they still have to go to school. And 77% of transgender youth are bullied in schools. And so the purpose of this presentation is us to open our eyes and for us to not make that world a little bit harder, but to make that world a little bit kinder for that youth. A different population that deserves some attention also is our human trafficking population. And the lesson from this presentation is really things may not be as they first appear. We started tracking human trafficking in 2009, and at that point in time, there were 43 reports. Last year, in 2018, there were 1,904 reports to the Department of Children and Families. 2009 was actually coincidentally when I first learned about human trafficking, and it's kind of odd how I learned about it. So, 2009, I live in the Tampa Bay area. Tampa that year was hosting the Super Bowl. I get a phone call from one of my old friends from college, Lisa. She says, Stephanie, I'm coming down. I'm going to be coming down to the Super Bowl. I didn't quite understand because Lisa was never a football fan. I said, why are you coming to the Super Bowl? And first, how can you afford the tickets to the Super Bowl? And she says, I'm actually coming for work. I had her have her explain it to me. Well, Lisa is an FBI agent. What is the equivalent of a special victims unit up in D.C.? And they employed all of their efforts to the Tampa Bay area because anytime there's a Super Bowl, there is suddenly this drastic increase in human trafficking. But then I also learned some really horrible things about the Tampa area as it specifically related to human trafficking. A few years after that, they actually produced a documentary on human trafficking about the Tampa Bay area, and I'd like to show you a little bit of it because, again, things may not be as they first appear. And we actually have one of our former judges, Judge Tepper, was featured in it quite prominently. So let me play a little bit of it for you. The video in total is 29 minutes. It's actually publicly available through the PBS organization. You can watch it online in full. The reason that I had you watch so much is because we sometimes have to be educated on what's happening on our own backyard. So some of those pictures of the facilities or places that they showed, the dance clubs, are literally right next to our Whole Foods and our Target. It's kind of scary. These are not in seedy locations necessarily. And these people can be walking around us, and more importantly, these kids can be on your caseload. Those 2 women that spoke last, they said nobody would have expected them. They came from the white picket fences. So this presentation really looks at how can you see the signs when they might not be on the surface, the things that you should look for with our youth, and really how those perpetrators work, because they are slick. They are very, very slick to convince our youth, and the crimes that really accompany them. And if you haven't seen the various legislative work that's happened over time, they're really trying to decriminalize the youth associated with human trafficking, because those youth can be wrapped up into various criminal enterprises against their will. So shifting gears to guardianship, the Regis Little Act. And the Regis Little Act lesson is that we have to start early. And that was the whole purpose of the Regis Little Act, is that we can start to establish guardianships for our youth before they turn 18, and so they can go into effect right away. Because what happened to Regis Little, we don't want to happen to anybody else. So Regis Little was actually a youth from the Orlando area, and he grew up in the system. He was scared of the dark. He didn't trust people. And at the age of 18, he was turned out from foster care with a $1,000 disability check that he didn't know how to spend. And sadly, he was killed in a parking lot over a beer. And so the Guardian Ad Litem program championed and advocated for the Regis Little Act to ensure that there are guardians in place to help our youth to manage the decisions that they need to make when they turn 18. So that presentation really talks about what you need under the Regis Little Act. You've got to identify the actual need for a guardian. There might be other less restrictive alternatives than guardianship, because guardianship in some way is assuming that there's an incapacity there. And once you have that incapacitation attached with you, that carries along with you for life. It also talks about the ability to identify a guardian. And there's qualifications for guardianship. And they're different whether you're a Florida resident or a non-resident. And there's reasons behind that. But there's 2 things that we need to keep in mind with our guardians and who's going to be able to qualify. So anybody that has a felony will never be able to be a guardian as long as the law exists the way they are now. So they gave the example in the room, what if they had a felony 20 years ago when they were a youth and they've changed and they changed their life? Can't they be a guardian to somebody? And under Florida, there's a zero tolerance. No, it doesn't matter what you did 20 years ago. The other thing is that guardians cannot be people who have a dependency finding against them. Because if a court has found that you've abused, abandoned, neglected somebody, that's an automatic disqualifier. That means that our parents who have worked the system, done all of their tasks to comply, got the children back and lived safely in some way, cannot be the guardian of their own children because they have that court finding. It definitely shrinks down then who can be a guardian. And if you guys haven't had a Regis Little kind of situation yet, I'll give you the warning, it's really hard to find the guardians. It's very, very hard to find them for these kids. One thing that is new for us, though, is during this legislative session, I believe Alan highlighted it earlier in the opening, is that we have changed the law in Florida so that now the guardianship proceeding can be either in the county where the youth resides or where the dependency case is heard. And why did they do that? Well, because some of our youth reside far outside of the county where the case is currently being heard. We didn't want them to have to file over in the county where they reside, where nobody connected with the case that knows about them is located. We wanted the opportunity to really be able to have the same court who knows that child address that case. And that's actually a great segue into our next topic, unified family court, or what I'd like to call one-stop shopping. In theory, unified family court can be a very, very positive thing. The idea is that you are going to have all of the divisions that impact a family in some way be unified. A lot of divisions, truancy, delinquency, dissolution of marriage. While we have what's called UFC in many of our areas around the state, anybody who practices in UFC knows it is not unified yet. There are components of it that might be unified, a few decisions that overlap, but we are not truly unified. And that's despite 4 Florida Supreme Court cases trying to get us there. What they're trying to get us to is the concept of one family, one judge. And I wrote it really tiny because it's supposed to be a less impractical, but really I should reverse the font size. So one family, one judge, unless impractical, because the unless impractical has really been controlling the conversation. And a lot of the conversation relates to geography. We have many courthouses around the state that are divided, and family is heard over here, and dependency is heard over here, and delinquency is heard over here. And so how can we have possibly one judge handle all these cases? And the Florida Supreme Court has said geography should not stand in your way. And so the Florida Supreme Court problem-solving Committee for Family and Children's in the Courts have constantly been looking at how we can get closer to the one family, one judge. And I'm going to warn you, they proposed something last year that was to actually remove the unless impractical and not give anybody an option out. And that was a little bit sensational when you talk about rules. You know, some of us rules gurus can really get into it. But that could be the direction that we go. And then what does that really mean for us as advocates? Where are we going to be showing up? What are our kids going to be expected to do? How often are they going to be pulled out and pulled in which direction? Now, to get back to this presentation and what this presentation did is they talked about some of the ways that unified family court can work for your family. So there's some guiding principles of unified family court. Ultimately, all the children should be in a safe home. Ultimately, everybody should be treated with dignity. But there's things that we're going to have to do to kind of make sense. For example, they talked about independency. What if you close the case out with not giving a particular parent the decision-making authority? So you have a situation where the child needs to be prescribed psychotropic medication. Mom wants it, dad doesn't. What do they do then? It requires more court action, when this could all be resolved by properly closing out a case and making sure those things are in place. Shifting gears to a different court proceeding, intervention. So intervention, the lesson of this one is keep the focus on the child. By a show of hands, how many people have in some way participated in an intervention case? That is quite a lot, yes. So intervention, when it first came around about 2012, was intended to allow our children to exit the system faster. And if we're all in the safe space of Vegas, we're all going to agree that it's not really working that way, right? Sometimes we are very fortunate to have people come in early and be able to get kids out. But recently, I saw a few people willing to raise like both hands because it feels like they have many intervention cases right now. The intervention cases now are becoming our new adversarial situation. And that was not really the intention. But what this presentation does is it wants you to keep the focus on the child. And so they talk about what intervention does and what the requirements of intervention are. And that somebody can, if they have a parent's consent, enter the dependency case, provide a home study on the proposed placement, and then have a best interest hearing as to whether it's in child's best interest to move. And there's a total of 8 best interest factors that the court can consider, from the current bond with the current caregiver, to what's best for the child, maintaining those sibling relationships, the child's preferences. It's kind of a little funny that it's down there at number 5, but it's still being included. Included, though, however, is the right of the parent to pick the home. And the presentation explores how you, as an advocate, can advocate all of these factors, whether it's in favor of intervention or against the change of placement. So advocacy. Advocacy is why we are here. This is the Advocacy Symposium. So we tried to train you on how to put that best foot forward, right? So the lesson from this presentation is preparation is key. So my name is Stephanie, and I'm here to admit I'm a procrastinator. This presentation tried to prepare you to not procrastinate. So preparation is key. You can't put off till the day before trial really what you need to do. And so they talked about the things that you should prepare for. And one of those things that you should prepare in advance is that trial notebook. And you should interview your witnesses. And they gave you examples of how you can do those things. If you haven't done a trial notebook before and you're a lawyer, please watch this presentation if you didn't already go. The trial notebook becomes your best buddy during that trial. The other thing that they tried to do was make you understand how to tailor your presentations to the particular cases. So they gave you demonstrations of opening and closings and how you can do direct examinations to get out that medical expert testimony that you need to establish that child's special needs. And then importantly, they provided you those predicate questions that you need of the most common types of evidence to establish those special needs of your kids. Keeping on the topic of advocacy, we had the expert witness testimony. And so my lesson from this presentation is actually expect the unexpected. It has nothing to do with experts. It has to do with what happened to our lovely ladies that had to present this topic. So for those who were not in there this morning, I got breaking news for you. The rug was pulled out from underneath them last Thursday because they had a beautiful presentation prepared for you on what standard applied to experts. And on Thursday, the Florida Supreme Court said, we're changing the standard on you. So what did they do? In 2013, the legislature passed a new standard called the Daubert standard, or Daubert. So we started to use the Daubert standard in our courtrooms, because what? The legislator passed it. It's the law. We all thought it was the standard, right? Well, in October, the Florida Supreme Court takes up the case, and they say, we're the court that decides procedural matters, not the legislature, and we are not adopting Daubert. It is going to be Fry, and that's the Delisle case. So Sarah, Laura, and Joanna were like, we need to inform everybody about this new Fry standard. This is perfect. This is going to fit in with our advocacy. And they prepared their presentation. And then Thursday, with no warning, no case, no petition, the Florida Supreme Court decides, we're going to change our minds. Because what? The court membership changed. If you guys didn't pay attention, we have 3 new justices on the Florida Supreme Court. And they, of their own accord, decided to take up the matter again and flip. So we are back to Daubert, and our lovely ladies had to present to you what that standard is. So, they talked to you about the reliability, and this comes back to the very first presentation we talked about due process. You have to have reliability with your experts in order for due process to be observed. And so that testimony has to be based on sufficient facts, it has to be the product of reliable principles, and the witness has to actually apply those principles to the facts. The only thing that really you could take away if you never practice law, if you're just a volunteer, or if you're some other member that's here that doesn't practice law. The difference between those two standards is who decides the reliability. So when in October, the Florida Supreme Court said the Frye test meant that the scientific community was the one that was going to decide what's reliable. That we're all going to agree that this is a reliable thing. Example, DNA testing. We're all going to agree that DNA testing is reliable. But at one point in time, the scientific community didn't even agree on that, right? Which is why Daubert came about. Daubert said, if a court can discern that something is so reliable, it can decide the reliability. It doesn't have to rely upon the scientific community. And so that's where we land. With the courts have the control over this, and they get to decide the reliability. So all of the presentations that we discussed today have been recorded. They're going to be available on the Guardian Ad Litem website. But I'm going to leave you with a final thought from our original poem that I referenced earlier, All the Things I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. The final rule of that presentation, or of that poem rather, is that when we go out in the world, we really should stick together. So like peanut butter and jelly, let's try to stick together as we represent these kids, try to be kind to one another. So thank you very much.
I just wanted to thank Stephanie for a great presentation. It was fun and informative. And I want to say thanks to all of you for coming, for presenting, for participating, for networking, and just remind you, please fill out the evaluations and the surveys. They're really, really important to us. That's how we continue to improve. So thank you all. Have a great weekend and safe travels.